Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. Last week on Think Tank, we discussed New York City, the good news and the not so good news. This week, on the second of two programs, we'll continue that discussion and widen our focus to include other American cities. Joining us in Cooper Union's Great Hall to sort through the conflict and the consensus are Fred Siegel, history professor at the Cooper Union and author of The Forthcoming Fall from Grace, New York, Washington, Los Angeles, and the Failure of Urban Liberalism. Esther Fuchs, director of the Barnard-Columbia Center for Urban Policy and author of Meyers and Money, Fiscal Policy in New York and Chicago. Michael Meyers, executive director of the New York Civil Rights Coalition and adjunct professor at Mercy College. And Jim Sleeper, member of the editorial board of the journal Dissent and author of The Closest of Strangers, Liberalism and the Politics of Race in New York. The topic before this house, New York, New York, and the future of American cities, the second of two programs this week on Think Tank. Last week on Think Tank, our panelists discussed the question, is there a new New York? This week we ask them to look at the national situation. Item: city size. Except for the immigrant gateways of New York and Los Angeles, the 10 largest cities in America have lost more than 20% of their population since 1950. Some say this has led to so-called urban donuts, crime-ridden cities surrounded by thriving suburbs. But in the new decentralized economy, other observers say cities actually need to get smaller to get healthier. Item: crime. Over 50% of city residents say they do not feel safe walking alone at night. But the largest 8 cities in America have seen their violent crime rates drop by an average of nearly 10% since 1994. Item: welfare. New York's 1.2 million welfare recipients make up about 14% of the population, not an atypical rate for big American cities. But the number of Americans on welfare has declined somewhat, and proposed new federal legislation could accelerate that trend. So the questions remain: are cities getting better or worse? And what should we do about the state of our cities? Is what is happening in New York, which seems to me, as I listen to you all, a picture of mixed progress. Is this something that is New York generated, they're ahead of the curve, giving an example to other cities, or has it been happening in other cities before New York? Is New York going to school in the other cities, or is it just happening? Let's start with Fred on this one. Okay.
Ben, when LaGuardia was mayor and he was president of the United States Conference of Mayors, you could talk about urban policy and the state of the cities. Cities today are dramatically divided. Southwestern and West Coast cities are doing extremely well. They have very little in common. Houston and Seattle and San Diego are doing very, very well. They have very little in common with the older rusting hulks of eastern cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia. The headline in the Philadelphia Inquirer recently read, and this is a city headed by a reform mayor, Ed Rendell, recently read, "Optimism for next year, job loss rate slows." So just to finish, I don't think we can any longer talk about national urban policy. Well, part of the reason it's so hard to formulate urban policy in Washington now is there's no policy that fits all the cities. San Jose, which is the center of Silicon Valley, is booming. It does not have problems in any way remotely similar to say, Baltimore or Philadelphia.
I would amend what Fred is saying slightly here. I think that in the 1970s, particularly, there was this dramatic chasm between a New York City and a Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Baltimore, the Rust Belt cities, and the Southwestern, what were called the economic growth cities. And that was really sort of exaggerated in the New York City fiscal crisis. You guys have nothing to do with the rest of us here. What you did, you created yourself. Well, what happened in the end of the 70s and early 80s is basically Southwest discovered that its economic boom was not forever too. And you know, most of the country thought that in fact New York was alone and we could dismiss it. Well, it turns out that New York wasn't alone, that New York was ahead of the curve on its problems, and in a sense, I don't say it was ahead of its curve on the solutions, but it was certainly ahead of the curve on revealing the extent to which urban America is plagued by, I think, a kind of never-ending problem of balancing budgets. And the biggest contributor to this for cities nationally is essentially having concentration of poverty in central cities right now.
America has always had a love-hate relation with cities. You know, you move to the suburb, you get a lawn with a split rail fence and a wagon wheel, it's your Ponderosa. If you want places where there's a lot of density, a lot of excitement, a lot of unpredictable contact, all the wonderful things that cities do, you're going to have to invest in it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean massive public sector subsidies.
There is out in the real world there, outside of Cooper Union and outside of the Beltway, there's a four-letter word that encompasses all that, which is MALL. I mean, you have malls in America
Right.
that are the size of medium-sized cities.
That's right.
What on earth is wrong with having them outside of the Beltway instead of inside of the Beltway?
Well, I think we'll find that out from the generation of young people that are growing up wholly in those malls without any previous urban experiences. I think we're getting mixed signals.
Excuse me, that is an urban experience.
Well, it's not what I would call an urban experience.
I want to ask another question. President Clinton has said that out-of-wedlock birth is our #1 problem. Conservatives have been saying that for about 1,000 years. The case has been made that the current mode of welfare policies have stimulated out-of-wedlock birth. Would tough-minded welfare reform, by which I mean making it harder to get on welfare and getting less money to make it less attractive, so that when a young girl gets pregnant, she decides she better get married because she's not going to make it the other way. Is this because we're all down in Washington talking about welfare reform, should this be a principal focus of urban reform and revitalization?
Well, President Clinton has about 10 #1 priorities.
What's your
welfare reform is one of them.
Would that be your #1 priority?
No, really, because I think it's one of those canards, one of those red herrings people keep chasing. Because if you talk, and everybody's in favor of welfare reform, because nobody wants people on welfare who don't deserve it and don't need it.
We had numbers before that showed a 6 to 7-fold increase of welfare.
Society has changed, Ben. Where you been?
Well,
you know,
yeah,
and the nature of poverty has increased, and this is where we agree. But this is where we agree.
Oh.
I mean, to the extent that people are having children, are making themselves more poor because they're having children, I think that's right. You need to tell people about the use of birth control. And until recently, we haven't even used television to do that. We used to have this Puritan notion about we can't talk about condoms on TV. I'm in favor of the kind of welfare reform that says, and I think the point is that the government is making it more difficult to be on welfare, believe me, and to stay on welfare. But the point is that it seems to me that the kind of welfare reform you need is, the most important kind is child care. Giving people child care so they can get out into the workforce and having jobs out there for them to take when they're available for the workforce.
That's right. If we're willing to spend $50 billion on a job, if you're asking whether welfare is part of that problem of out-of-wedlock births, yes. But if you're asking whether a dramatic cutback in welfare would reverse that problem, I think the answer is no.
Esther Fuchs, you have been shaking your head, no, welfare doesn't lead to illegitimacy, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a big problem, is a big problem.
That's an important point here, and if we want to talk about truly getting people into self-sufficiency and off welfare, which I think, as Michael pointed out, there is a general consensus out there, regardless of ideology, that able-bodied people should be working, there should be jobs for people. One needs to be realistic about the situation. First of all, in most large cities, the preponderance of people on welfare are children. And the other...
wait a minute, please, but the
you
payments...
need to know that there are children.
But every child, by definition, has a mother.
Right.
And the payments are going to mothers.
The payments are going to
the- to
mothers
take care of children.
So, but when you construct a reform,
Yeah.
which I think we need to do, one needs to be reality-based, that somebody has to take care of these children who exist and who are out there. There are two stages in correcting the problem. It's one, what you want to do in the future, but one, what you want to do with the current population of welfare recipients.
Stipulated.
So you have to deal with the children as well as the mothers. And that, I think, is something that people are not realistically paying attention to. So you need to have a really significant investment in child care if you really want to put moms to work.
I must say, this whole thing puzzles me. The one thing you have in the inner city, an abundance of, is people who need work. Mothers are out of work. Mothers who are taking care of their own children. Why daycare is a problem here is beyond me. It seems like the easiest thing in the world to allow mothers who are already taking care of their own children to take care of other children.
The other problem, the other priority that Clinton talks about, number one priority, and that is the family breakdown. So even as you, Fred, are looking for these grandmothers and these mothers, supposedly, they're not there according to President Clinton's priority.
All right, now hold on. Hold it. I want to move on just for a moment because we are running out of time. There has been a lot of talk in the urbanology community, in the budget, in the municipal budget community, that the road out deals with privatization and reinventing government. You have all studied many cities. Is that another buzzword, or is something happening out there?
I'd say right up front there are a couple obvious problems. Privatization in New York City, the earliest ventures we had, produced a lot of corruption and a lot of waste.
What
Some of
about
our
outside of New York
biggest
City?
municipal scandals. No, all I'm saying is that privatization in itself, I happen to agree that a lot of things should be privatized because municipal unions have strangled them, but it's how it's done is
Michael,
very
if
important.
you have traveled around the country, do you get a sense that this is something big and for real and good, or is
I get a sense, by the way, that particularly poor people don't like public type things. They don't like having to go into a public hospital and sitting in an emergency room and waiting for hours and not getting decent care and being charged $125 for a visit from an anonymous doctor. Now, if privatization could be something other than a buzzword, if privatization could really improve the quality of life for an enormous number of people, hey, I'm for it. And I'm also against big government. I think most people are against big government that's inefficient and irresponsible and costly.
Can it? I'm asking you as an observer and a scholar and a student.
I think it
is
can.
there evidence that it is doing it?
I think privatization can work, particularly in terms of schools, but it works for fewer people than the public sector, because the public sector virtually appeals to and responds to the needs of the masses, just as public schools.
One of the best examples of privatization working is a company called America Works. It has an extraordinary record of taking people on welfare and placing them in paying jobs with health insurance.
With governmental subsidy, Fred.
I'm not arguing, I'm not saying government doesn't have to be involved, but what's interesting is they do what private welfare departments can't do. They make their living by placing people. If the Department of Welfare of the New York City doesn't place people, which it doesn't, there's no consequence. People continue to receive their salaries.
Their payments.
Their payments.
Right.
If America Works doesn't place people in long-term jobs, if people don't stay in the jobs, they don't make a profit. This is an example where privatization has worked brilliantly. But precisely because it's worked brilliantly, it's generated tremendous public sector opposition from public sector unions.
But the America Works people tell me, tell me that program works because of the mothers from welfare somehow get some sort of governmental subsidy, such as child care and extension of Medicaid benefits. Those are forms of welfare.
Excuse my ignorance. Is America Works national?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
In seven cities.
Right.
But I think
What cities besides New York?
It's in Chicago,
Indianapolis.
New York, Indianapolis, and in Chicago as well.
And do you think it's working?
Going into Baltimore and the empowerment center. I think it's a wonderful program also, but I agree with Michael that it's a partnership with government. And I think that this either-or syndrome that we're in is not really the way to go. I mean, one thing that most people probably don't realize is that cities have been privatizing for a very long time. Social services in this country are by and large done by contracted out, not-for-profit or for-profit private, quotes, organizations. You know, you look at the so-called charities, Catholic charities, Jewish charities, Protestant charities, all of their social services functions are essentially contracts from government, okay? So, you know, the irony of the privatization argument is, you know, goes back to Jim's point, I think, is that you have to be forever vigilant. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and what we need to do is look at the areas in which it's most constructive and can work well.
Senator Coates of Indiana and Chairman Kasich of Ohio have introduced a 17-bill package, the jewel of which is a $1,000 per couple tax credit, not deduction, tax credit for charitable giving, which is in effect a federal government subsidy to private charitable agencies. That you would, I mean, I heard Coates explain it, and he said if you had a choice between giving your money, giving $1,000 to the Department of Human Services in Chicago or whatever, or picking your own charity to give it to, who would you give it to? And wouldn't it be more efficient? Does that make sense?
No, I mean, I really think that that's missing the point of the problem. I mean, first of all, if you are a public sector agency providing social services and you have a caseload, which has been the case in New York and other cities, counties, of 50 cases per caseworker, and you have no capacity to provide jobs, well, that's a poorly run agency in which you're not going to get, you know, much service from. Basically, a lot of agencies have been constructed that way, partly because of budget cuts, partly because of inefficiencies. But in order to improve that, you could improve that either through the public sector providing a better service with maybe 15 cases, or you could privatize.
You just said that the public sector provides inefficient services. You just said it.
But why? Partly because they're completely underfunded. You can't be a caseworker with 50 jobs, 50 cases.
Are you making the case that before the budget cuts, these agencies were working efficiently?
No. Some, and that, I mean, I'll go back to my original point, which is to say you need to look at it service by service to see what works and what doesn't work. But what I'm saying is, for sure, your public sector agency is not going to work if you have 50 cases per caseworker.
But you know, I think the Coates bill raises
completely impossible.
The Coates package raises an important principle, which is that the choice shouldn't always have to be just between either having a large public sector bureaucracy or having the government doing the contracting out, which it often does also very poorly. Now, he's pointing to a third alternative, which in certain ways, in certain areas, might be better. That certain kinds of charitable provision would make sense if there was really money going into them from people who are not bound by the same strictures that government bureaucrats
Could that help cities across America, Fred?
I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical for the following reasons. The reason private sector organizations work is because they can set their own standards. If they begin to accept government money, they'll lose the ability to set their own standards.
That's my point.
But wait a minute. His point is that it's not government money. It is you are writing a check to the YMCA, and you then deduct 100% of that on your taxes, never going through the government. That's the way he would.
But Ben, the problem with that is someone in Congress will see this as a tax expenditure, and it will become an issue.
But that's the
question. The question of money is crucial. The city of Washington, D.C. has more money to spend per capita, per case of any type, and take any type of social ailment than any other city in America. The city is in total collapse. There's no toilet paper in the city hall. It can't plow its roads in the middle of the winter. The problem with public sector bureaucracies is they're incapable of setting standards and holding people to them. Once you bring government in, directly or indirectly, it'll be seen as a public issue.
But isn't that the point of the Coates bill, is to take government out?
Yeah, but my argument is that what the Coates bill will do by providing tax credit the way it does, indirectly will bring government in to ruin those existing private institutions.
Let's finish up this fascinating discussion on sort of a broader topic. 30 or so years ago, I know when I started writing books about the census, it was sort of a rule of thumb that America was divided into thirds. It was a third city, a third suburb, and a third rural. In the course of the last 30 years, the suburban sector has grown so rapidly. It is now 51, 52%. I mean, for the first time in American history in the last few years, you can make a statement, America's a suburban nation, and you can prove it. I mean, or majority suburban. You could never say it was majority urban or majority rural or majority suburban. And there are good reasons for that. People have problems with cities. They want the quarter acre of, they want space, they want places for their kids, whatever.
They don't want to deal with the poverty population concentrated in central cities.
They don't want to deal with parks that aren't kept clean and orderly.
Absolutely. Now, long range, are we going to deal with this massive problem of our cities, or are we just going to sort of organically move them out of town? Fred?
Cities, the huge cities, 19th century cities that were created no longer have an economic rationale. New York cannot sustain 7.5 million people economically. We grew these enormous cities when the railroad was the primary means of transportation, when it was all energy was concentrated in these focal points. The automobile, the truck has dispersed populations, dispersed economic activities long before the fax and the computer. Cities can never again have the role they once had.
Is that the good news or the bad news?
It's the facts. It's neither good. Cities have to adjust. Cities have a tremendous role in the future. Creativity, intellectual creativity, economic creativity is going to take place in cities like New York and Los Angeles, where the digital economy is being created as we sit here. That's going to give cities an important role for the future. There's a very interesting story recently. MCI moved out of Washington, moved to Boulder, Colorado. They discovered that their creativity dried up. Colorado Springs. People couldn't operate there. They needed a cosmopolitan atmosphere where people are constantly interacting on a face-to-face basis.
They decided it's been a mistake.
It's been a mistake
They're still
because
out there.
And now they want to...
they lacked in Colorado Springs the energy, the diversity that allows for kind of intellectual creativity in the economy.
So you think there is a role for cities, but it's not going to be...
It's a different one. It's not mega city. You know, Manhattan has an economic future. It's not clear that the city of 5 boroughs has an economic future. Right. The San Fernando Valley is seceding from Los Angeles. It's not clear that the unified city of Los Angeles has an economic future. But the creative portions of the economy are going to be places like the Bay Area, San Jose, Los Angeles, and New York, and Boston. These cities have a bright future.
Cities have an important role in the future of the economy, but it's not all cities, and that's part of the problem, with the general conversation. There are global cities like New York, Miami, Chicago, Los Angeles, which will be connected to this world economy that we're dealing with now, and they are different in kind than Newark or Gary, Indiana, or cities which have essentially been ravaged by deindustrialization, were one-company towns, and now are basically bastions of poverty. There are cities which are too small, which have declined to such a point in which they don't have any economic base in which to sell themselves anymore to anybody. And I think that...
For example, which
and that
one?
I really...
You said Gary
I would
and
say
Newark.
Gary, Camden, even Newark, that these were cities which were company towns, which essentially lost their company. And the result of that is dramatic economic decline and concentrations of poverty. And our problem now in the federal system is that we're telling these cities that they need to create an economic base to support these poverty populations. It doesn't make any sense. So that we need a policy which addresses that problem separately.
Go ahead.
I agree with Esther about the global city thing. We can't predict what the economic configurations will be. But in the meantime, I think it's true that those cities are needed not only for intellectual creativity, but as a staging ground, as a crucible for immigrants. Clearly, you have to have immigrant enclaves in cities. Those kinds of things are going to work for the half-dozen cities she mentioned. For the others, I agree, it's very problematic unless there's some new kind of economic investment that we haven't envisioned yet. And the last point on that is, in 1975 in New York, people never foresaw the immense financial services boom. Even here, people thought it was all going to shrink to 5 million then. It didn't in part.
5 million people.
That's right. Things do pop up, but not everywhere and not in every place.
Michael Meyers, last word.
Some cities will be dysfunctional and won't be able to be revitalized. There are some cities that must be revitalized and must survive, like New York City, like Los Angeles. And as you look at the suburbs, you need cities at the very least for people who will get tired of the suburbs to come back to. And moreover, you have problems going out to the suburbs. The kind of city problems are going out to find themselves in the suburbs: crime and drugs and housing problems. And so I think as we build our society, we have to really think about like town and gown. We have to think about city and suburb as being joined. Our destiny is joined because we are one people. Let's get back together and act like that.
Thank you, Fred Siegel, Esther Fuchs, Michael Meyers, and Jim Sleeper. And thank you. We enjoy hearing from our viewers. Please send your comments and questions to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. We can also be reached via email at thinktv@aol.com or on the World Wide Web at www.thinktank.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.